So let's get one thing out of the way right off the bat. Am I the only person who just learned what Paris syndrome is? Am I? Did you all know what it was? You caught that term in the modern testimony, right? That terrifying term. Paris syndrome is apparently characterized by shocked physical symptoms like shortness of breath, heart palpitations, sweating, and arousal, sometimes even hallucinations, and all of these physical and psychological disturbances are caused by the discrepancy between visitors' expectations about Paris and the reality of Paris. The fact that the reality of Paris often bears little resemblance to the city described in the words of guidebooks, films, and television. I have been planning a trip to Paris for over a year, and none of you told me about Paris syndrome. Well, rest assured, your fear-filled minister has returned from Paris having avoided this terrifying possibility. There was some lightheadedness while climbing the hilly terrain of Montmartre. There was perhaps a bit of hallucination brought on by bottles of the best wine guzzled on the banks of the Seine, but Matt and I have survived our Paris trip without a syndrome-induced scratch. But apparently this is a real thing. Paris syndrome can be traced back to the 1970s and almost exclusively affects Japanese travelers. Extreme cases include panic attacks and convulsions, which can lead to hospitalization. And every year, the Japanese embassy sends at least a dozen tourists to recover at home from extreme culture shock. They even run a dedicated 24-hour helpline offering aid in coping with the illness. You better believe I did my research now. Apparently, like most things, the reality of Paris, both the good and the bad, just can't be captured accurately in human words, though many, many try. Now, I'm not a wholly superstitious person, but I find it uncanny that I chose Olga Tokarczuk's latest novel, Flight, as my travel reading companion, and that less than 100 pages in, she characterizes Paris syndrome, and that I, panic-prone preacher that I am, read about this ailment while sitting in Paris. And you all know I thought about Paris syndrome constantly for the rest of the trip. And I hope it's clear already how often I think of all of you, even when I am thousands of miles away. I could not wait to get back here and share my newfound nerve-jangling knowledge with you. But before Paris syndrome entered my periphery, our trip was going swimmingly. We left on Friday, June 29th, planning to escape our normal lives for a while, escape the news, escape our constant pull to do more, to keep moving, to never stop, to escape the fact that hopeless anger and complacent despair seem more and more attractive every day. And we lifted off from JFK with only one regret. Both of us had forgotten to get a haircut. And our coiffes were right on the brink of being too long. You know that feeling where it's not too long one night and then you wake up the next morning and you look like a sloppy bohemian bumpkin? You are witnessing it right now. I am in full bloom. I also decided that along with reading Tokarczuk's novel in Paris, I wanted to catch up on the parables of Jesus, since reading his little stories about the kingdom of God is one of the only things consistently keeping me afloat as more and more terrible news about more and more slashings of our democracy continue to pelt us in the face every day. So I thought, I'll read a novel and I'll read the Bible. That'll cover it. That'll be my nerdy, rejuvenating combination antidote. The only other reading material we had with us were printouts of several emails we'd received, some of them from some of you, outlining favorite Paris restaurants and stores and haunts, dozens of recommendations from our very worldly, very cultured friends. These were our only guides. We followed Tokarczuk's idea that published guidebooks would be unnecessary. We didn't want the disconnected, impersonal descriptions of some stuffy travel writer we don't know. We wanted the passionate plans of our friends, the beloved suggestions of our beloved community. Granted, none of you warned us about Paris syndrome, but all is forgiven. My only fear was that I would offend someone by asking them to speak to me in English. I basically know enough Spanish to convince an ICE officer I should be allowed to accompany someone into their check-in, enough German to buy apples and milk, and enough French to basically panic if someone starts asking me a question in French. Matt minored in French, so I figured all would be okay as long as I stayed pinned to his hip. He ordered the coffee, the wine, the food, the wedding rings we finally purchased a year after our ceremony and which I have forgotten to wear today. All was magnifique. That's French. Paris syndrome seemed to be at bay. I had my own personal interpreter. I had the suggestions of some very dear friends. I had a novel, and I had the Bible in the most indescribably beautiful city I'd ever seen. What could go wrong? Parables are the perfect thing to read every morning while traveling. They're short, pithy, and leave you with a perfect little mystery at the end that you can take with you and continue to unravel for the remainder of the day. There are about 36 parables sprinkled throughout the Gospels, and I only got to 9 of them while I was away, but what occurred to me each morning as I awoke to each new one is that parables are Jesus' way to describe the indescribable, to approach the unapproachable, to point us humans toward connection and beauty we are not prepared to understand. Centuries before Jesus had been born, the psalmist had written that parables have the power to proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world. And Jesus situated himself in that tradition. His basic premise was that describing the overwhelming beauty of the kingdom of God could never actually be adequately done using human words. The human mind and heart are inherently incapable of understanding the power of God until we transform into wholly new beings. And the closest human beings can get to a description is through metaphor and simile, neither quite approaching the ultimate reality. Now, a friend of mine says that you can't actually name God, because once you do, you've already forgotten God and put yourself in God's place. And I tend to think Jesus had a similar belief in the simultaneous power and shortcomings of human words. He used parables to nudge his listeners' imaginations open, to prompt them to think of things they'd never thought possible, to move past their puny human visions to new visions beyond the realm of immediate understanding. And until humans can grasp the ultimate reality, humans use metaphor and simile. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. The kingdom of God is like a sower. The kingdom of God is like a pearl. The kingdom of God is like treasure hidden in a field, like a fishing net, like wheat among weeds. Parables don't give you the answer. They conjure images and space and leave us to fill in the blanks. And as I read these parables in Paris, And as I pondered Paris syndrome, I got to wondering whether we Christians have a little God syndrome going on, and whether we Americans have a little democracy syndrome going on, and whether we've all got a little hope syndrome going on. We have all the human words to describe what we want all of them to be, all the fancy metaphors and similes that might circle around what God and democracy and hope kind of are. But the reality is that all three require so much more imagination than we're often prepared to give. All three require so much more curiosity and commitment and care and work and witness and openness and agility than we humans have in our immediate periphery. What if, instead of falling into despair, we took the devastating rubble and saw it as an invitation to collectively build new visions for all three: God, democracy, hope? Visions we haven't ever thought possible. To illustrate, here's a little parable from my last full day in Paris. Matt and I had stayed constantly conjoined up to this point. I had successfully sidestepped being addressed in French. I had agilely avoided being left alone to wonder whether Paris syndrome might be setting in. But on that day, Matt wanted to make a clothing purchase. And collaborative clothes shopping is just something we don't do. Every couple has their stress-inducing thing that is our thing. So I reluctantly left him to go do his clothes shopping, and I set out into the foreign wilderness of Le Marais alone. I dared to buy an espresso, basically by grunting under my breath and pointing until the barista said, "Espresso?" And I enthusiastically acclaimed, "Wee!" And then I went and sat on a park bench, burying my face in a book. And after a few moments, I felt someone sit down next to me. I didn't dare look up, lest I disappoint some friendly Parisian with my lack of global guts. But as seconds passed, I could feel eyes on me. And I glanced over to see a disheveled 30-something man covered in a light coating of what looked like soot, gnawing at something scrunched up in a ball of aluminum foil. And as soon as I made eye contact with him, my nightmare came to life. He spoke to me in French and then waited for my answer. It felt like an eternity. And finally, I just bit the bullet and said, "I'm so sorry. I don't speak French." And his smile grew wide. And he said, "I am just saying, your hair, it is so funny." And I said, "I try." And his smile grew even wider. And he said, "It is so funny. Thank you so much." And I said, "Absolutely." And his smile got even wider. And he said, "Thank you so much. Have a great day." And then he stood up, popped his aluminum foil ball into his pocket, and walked away. And I thought, the kingdom of God is like funny hair. The kingdom of God is like a stranger on a park bench. The kingdom of God is like being invited into a conversation you dreaded and realizing it's going to be okay. The kingdom of God is like being thanked for something you didn't know you were giving. The next morning, Matt and I had very little time to get to the airport, so we opted to pick up coffee and drink it on the way. And when we got to the metro station, we remembered that we hadn't really seen any other people carrying coffee on the metro. So, attempting to avoid cultural embarrassment, we sat down in a park across the street from the station to drink our coffee. And after a few minutes, Matt pointed and said, "Look." And I looked up to see the sign that's on your bulletin cover, showing us that the name of the park is Place du Père Teilhard de Chardin. Now, some of you know that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin is my favorite theologian of all time. And without any guidebooks, without any of our printouts, without any plans, we had ended up in a place we'd never imagined, a place we'd never even knew existed. And I thought of my favorite of Teilhard's words: "You are not a human being in search of a spiritual experience. You are a spiritual being immersed in a human experience." May we remember this fact, even as the anger continues to rise in our hearts. May we remember this fact as we try to look for hope among the rubble of our democracy syndrome and our God syndrome and all the other syndromes that make us fear the reality of who we can become. May we remember St. Augustine of Hippo's parable, in which he said that hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way things are. We are living parables for one another every time we meet in this place. We bring our anger, we bring our courage, and we together conjure the hope we don't have the strength to find on our own. The old official guidebooks have been abused to the point of often being useless. We're recognizing that now as our faith and our democracy are corroded by power. But we create new guidebooks by sharing our passion, our love, by sharing stories, parables of the magical places we've found that pushed us beyond our anger and despair. We dream impossible dreams here. And we think to ourselves, what a wonderful world is possible. And say that in the face of those who want to make it something less. We are sustaining ourselves on moments of unexpected and indescribable connection and beauty, and we will sustain ourselves on moments of unexpected and indescribable connection and beauty. So let's not limit ourselves. And let's certainly not limit the truth of God. Let's rise as we are able and become the hope we fear we can't conjure. And while we're at it, let's actually rise as we are able, in body and or spirit. And let's sing together the impossible dream.